Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Today, we're thrilled to have Professor Paulina Sliwa. She's Professor of Moral and Political Philosophy at the University of Vienna. She was formerly at the other place, the University of Cambridge. She works in ethics, epistemology, and the intersection thereof, and she'll be presenting on her paper, Apologies in Anatomy. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me. If you think about the literature on moral responsibility, and apologizing is part of our practice of taking moral responsibility, in particular taking responsibility. Apologies really are very under-theorized. Like, philosophers have lots to say about blaming. They have comparatively little to say about apologizing for whatever reason. And then when people do write about apologies, it's from these two different angles, both of which are quite peculiar. On the one hand, you have a pretty large literature on kind of apologies for really major historical wrongs that are done publicly. So apologies for historical injustice, like when the Guardian editor apologizes for Guardian's links to slavery. And then the other stuff is the literature that's kind of very, very it's quasi-religious, and it's all about like reconciliation and how you make yourself vulnerable in apologizing. And both of these strike me, they don't quite get at the heart of the matter of just like ordinary interpersonal apologies, where we're not apologizing for mass murder, we're not apologizing for like terrible injustices, we're like simply apologizing for like a broken promise, or a missed appointment, or a forgotten birthday, or a broken coffee mug. Those are the kinds of apologies that I'm interested in. And so my question here will be, how do these apologies work? The second thing that I should say, just by way of situating, is that this paper is very much a work in progress. It's also part of a bigger project. So the normative footprint account that I will be presenting later on, I've been kind of working on how that framework helps us to make sense of various aspects of our practice of moral responsibility. So I've kind of written in the same framework on how to think about excuses, how to think about taking responsibility more generally, how to think about blame, and I'm quite interested in writing something on forgiveness as well. So this is kind of part of the big puzzle. Okay, so let me start by saying some really obvious things about apologies, and then I will consider three proposals for what is distinctive about apologies, how we can characterize apologies, what constitutes them, and I will argue that none of those proposals are very convincing. They all fall short in a variety of cases where we do apologize, and then I'll present my own account, the normative footprint account. Okay, and so let me start with just saying something obvious, namely apologies are something that's really out there, that also sets them apart from other phenomena in moral responsibility, because you can blame people silently, you can forgive silently, but when you apologize, you are you're necessarily putting something out there, you're communicating something. It's typically a speech act, typically you communicate it verbally, but of course you can also apologize by an imploring look, or by giving someone flowers, a bunch of flowers. So the typical marker of apology is saying I'm sorry, but of course it's not decisive. I mean, we all, being in the UK right now, are like well aware of the fact that saying I'm sorry is not always the marker of an apology. Saying I'm sorry that you feel this way, definitely not an apology. Something passive aggressive rather. But also saying something like, I'm sorry that you are in this hard situation, also not an apology, it's simply an expression of sympathy. But very often, I'm sorry does mark the fact that we're apologizing. And what happens in that case is that we say that I say that I'm sorry that I screwed up or I forgot, as opposed to saying that I'm sorry about a particular state of affair. So what distinguishes apologies from just uses of I'm sorry as an apology from uses of I'm sorry as a kind of general expression of sympathy or passive-aggressive accusation is that it it concerns a particular action of mine, and it's offered from this first personal agential perspective. So the second thing I want to say is that I will be focusing here on apologies for wrongdoing or for norm violations. So sometimes we apologize for making requests. So we might apologize for asking a friend to pick us up somewhere when it's inconvenient to them. I think it's really interesting what happens in that case, but I'm not going to be focusing on that. I will be just focusing on cases where I have done a wrong. I've violated a norm. I've infringed on someone's right. I've fallen short of a duty of mine. And what's important in those cases, in order for the I'm sorry to make up an apology, is that it needn't just be directed at this action of mine, which I did, but it needs to recognize that action as a norm violation or as a wrong. So, we apologize for falling short of a particular duty or for violating a norm. And often we say that, we explicitly acknowledge that. We say, I'm sorry for being rude, or I'm sorry for having been thoughtless. But often, kind of in the context of conversation, the norm is also just left implied. It's kind of the salient norm in the context. But what's important is that it's only an apology insofar as it admits that the action that I'm apologizing for constituted a norm violation. And we can see that really easily. Suppose I tell you, I apologize for telling you that you're spineless and duplicitous, but of course there is absolutely nothing wrong with me telling you this. That's just incoherent. There's no apology here. Contrast this with, I apologize for telling you that you're utterly spineless and duplicitous. What I said is true, of course, but I shouldn't have said that. In that case, unlikely to lead to reconciliation, but it is fine as it's not defective qua apology. It's a fine apology as far as apologies go. Okay, so what we have then, we have a really minimal condition on apologies so far, that it's a speech act which admits to having violated a norm. And the question we can then ask is, what else do we need in order to make up an apology? What are other conditions that the speech act needs to satisfy in order to constitute an apology? And so here are just three proposals that I'll take you through fairly quickly. One proposal that's really popular is that what happens when you apologize is that not only do you kind of add to the conversational common ground that you have violated this norm, but you also express remorse for having done so. Lots of people think that. I've given you a few quotes on the handout, like Bovins, who says, a genuine apology expresses certain emotions. There is an emotion of a remorse about one's wrongdoing, and there is the emotion of sympathy with the harm or hurt that may have been caused by one's wrongdoing. Martin also says, Adrian Martin, an apology typically includes saying that one knows one flouted a legitimate norm and regrets it. And the thing to say is that Martin understands, she says regret, but really she means remorse, which is clear from the rest of the things that she says in the paper. So that's a kind of common line. And I mean, I think, it's not that this is completely wildly implausible. You can see why people think that's attractive. Often apologies fall short in many contexts, particularly in the context of grave wrongdoing. An apology will fall short in some way if it doesn't express remorse. And of course, often we are motivated by remorse to apologize. We apologize because we feel terrible about what we've done, and that explains, that motivates us to apologize. So clearly there's some connection with remorse and apology, but I think it's a mistake to construe that connection too tightly. We shouldn't take the connection to be constitutive, and that's because apologies can be felicitous. They can be non-defective as apologies without any expressions of remorse. And we can see that just when we think about the kind of variety of things that we typically apologize for, right? So one of the things that we might apologize for is for having wronged someone with justification or excuse. So suppose I promise my roommate to pick up some decongestant for them. They have a stuffy nose on my way to work. And what happens is that I come across an accident. There's a cyclist who's fallen off the bike, and I need to call the ambulance and make sure that they're okay, and so I don't manage to pick up the decongestant. So in that particular case, I would apologize to my roommate and would say I owe them an apology. But it would be really strange for me to pair that apology with an expression of remorse. There's nothing to feel remorseful about. I might, of course, regret the sad fact that they will now have to live through the night with a stuffy nose. That's a regrettable circumstance, but that's not the same as kind of expressing remorse. Another kinds of cases, in cases of bad moral luck, like Bernard Williams' lorry driver who kills a child accidentally through no fault of his own. Bernard Williams says himself that the lorry driver would typically apologize in that case to the family. But of course, you might think in that case, again, remorse is not the right emotion to feel insofar as the apology is kind of fully fitting or appropriate. It's agent regret that's the relevant emotion. And similarly, often we apologize for really trivial things that cause minor inconvenience, and where also remorse or guilt seem unwarranted. So it seems like they're obviously, if your paradigm of an apology is an apology for really grave, terrible wrongdoing, then of course you're going to be led to posit this close connection between apologies and remorse. But I think the problem here lies with focusing too much on one particularly narrow paradigm. Okay, so remorse, not remorse out. Let's consider another case, another proposal, which is going to fail basically for similar reasons, which is that to apologize is not just to communicate that one's action has violated a norm, but it is also a request to be forgiven. And again, lots of people say that. Tavuhis, who's one of the kind of very emotionally laden writers of apology, says, the helpless offender in consideration for nothing more than a speech act asks for nothing less than the conversion of righteous indignation and betrayal into unconditional forgiveness and reunion. So that's part of the apology. And similarly, Murphy. Okay, but again, I think something similar. Well, actually, not quite similar. It fails for related, but not quite the same reasons. So the first thing to note is just that there's nothing incoherent about a request for or an apology with an explicit denial that you're asking for forgiveness. Like, there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to say how sorry I am. And in fact, that kind of apology will often be apt, and it will, interestingly, be particularly apt when the wrongdoing has been very, very grave and serious. Because in that case, asking to be forgiven just seems like impudence as opposed to appropriate in the context, right? Like, there's one example is like, suppose you have this father who left his family when the children were little and never kept in touch, never sent any money, and the children track him down when the mother is dying, and he rejoins the family for the funeral. So now that might be a circumstance where it would certainly be appropriate for the father to apologize for his absence. It would be ridiculous to ask for forgiveness in that circumstance, because it's too big an ask in the circumstance. It just burdens the other party with something that is inappropriate. So requests for forgiveness are actually quite tricky, and we certainly shouldn't think that they're part of any successful apology. So that's for very major wrongs, but the same goes actually for very minor wrongs. If I've been late by 10 minutes for a cinema appointment with my friend, and I look her in the eye and say, please forgive me, like, that's just a bit weird and a bit over the top. And in fact, it's a bit offensive too, because if you think about, at least if you're sympathetic to a view of forgiveness, where forgiveness involves the forswearing of resentment, the kind of typical butler take on forgiveness, then when you ask someone in this trivial situation to forgive you, you are implicating that there is this resentment that is to be forsworn. But in the cases of these very minor wrongs, like very minor annoyances, even feeling this degree of resentment is just inappropriate. So you're basically, by asking too seriously for forgiveness in that circumstances, you are implying that the other person thinks this is a really big deal, even though it wasn't. So interestingly here, both the kind of request for forgiveness seems to misconstrue both the apologies for very, very major wrongs and apologies for very minor wrongs. So I think that's out, even though, of course, it's not the case that there is no connection at all between forgiveness and apology, but whatever the connection is, it's going to be more subtle than simply an apology needs to ask for forgiveness in order to be successful as an apology. Okay, so here's a third proposal, repairing one's interpersonal commitment. So that's a really popular one. So here, again, Bovens, I think, formulates it most clearly. He says, a genuine apology expresses counterfactual and conditional commitments. There is a counterfactual commitment that if the clock were turned back, then I would act differently. There is a conditional commitment that if I encounter a future situation that is similar in morally relevant respects, then I will act differently. And similarly, Martin says, what you do when you apologize, you make this quasi-promise to repair your lack of interpersonal commitment. It's this kind of quasi-contractual interaction. And again, here, I think we have to be really careful, because I think there's something in the vicinity of what those people are saying, which is true, but exactly the thing that they're implying is not true. So what is true is that if you are going to apologize for violating a norm, you better also express commitment to that norm. So it would be very strange to say, it would be defective to say, I apologize for having been so rude to you. Of course, I myself do not much care for the norms of politeness. Like, that just doesn't fly as an apology. So in order to apologize, you need to express commitment to that norm. And if you express commitment to the norm, you thereby express the fact that your conduct will in general be guided by that norm, right? So you express this kind of, you say there's like a robust connection between the norm and your conduct. But I think it's a mistake to think that you are thereby, if you apologize for violating a norm, you are admitting to an inadequate commitment to the norm, or you're apologizing for you're promising to repair that inadequate commitment. And the reason for that is that we often apologize for falling short in the cases where our commitment was perfectly adequate. And the clearest case here are cases of excuses. So this is something that I have argued for elsewhere. I've argued that excuses are considerations that show that the agent's wrongdoing does not reflect her lack of a morally adequate present directed intention, which is basically the same as a commitment to the norm. And I mean, I think the clearest way of seeing this is cases where I simply lose my nerve or lose my patience. So in the case, so suppose I snap, I'm really tired. My partner and I are trying to decide which movie we're going to watch, and I snap at them because I'm so tired. So in that case, it's not that I'm not committed to being kind to my partner and this inadequate commitment caused me to snap at them. I'm perfectly committed to that norm. It's just that in the situation where I was really tired and maybe hungry and maybe really stressed about something, I simply couldn't put that commitment into action. I couldn't act on that commitment. And so it's not like I owe a promise to repair it. It's just inadequate, it's just inevitable given the creatures we are that sometimes, however adequate our commitment, we are not going to be able to act on it. And if we do so, we apologize. But in that case, we're not apologizing for inadequate commitment. And again, another example are apologies for justified wrongs, as in the case of the decongestant. I can apologize to my roommate for not picking up the decongestant, but I certainly am not saying that if the clock were turned back, I would leave the cyclist at the side of the road and rush to the pharmacy instead. nor am I saying that in similar situations, if that came up again, I would act differently. I would act exactly the same as I did, yet still the apology seems perfectly fine. So I think, again, repairing one's interpersonal commitment shouldn't be taken as constitutive of apologies. Okay, so now an obvious objection is that I have been really unfair to the people I have been arguing for. And the objection says, look, the problem is that, I've construed these proposals as necessary conditions for when a speech act can count as an apology, but that's not the spirit in which they're put forward. They are put forward in a kind of ameliorative spirit. These people that I've been citing, they're not really interested in kind of characterizing our actual practice. They're interested in what an ideal apology should be like. And so they're trying to kind of excavate this ideal of an apology. And it seems that objection is not entirely far-fetched. Certainly some people explicitly say they're interested in telling us what an ideal apology would look like, as opposed to telling us what actual apologies look like. So Davis says explicitly, it is important to clarify the nature of the treatment I'm offering. It is not primarily descriptive. I'm not attempting to show what people always, in fact, do when they purport to apologize. Instead, I'm trying to unpack a normative paradigm which underlies our apology practices and responses. Similarly, Smith says he's interested in a prescriptive project about what apologies should be as opposed to what apologies are. And even the people who are presenting it in the more descriptive spirit, they modify their accounts by saying, well, a genuine apology, which again suggests that they are, describing something, an ideal, as opposed to, the actual practice. However, I think even if that's true, even if the spirit in which those proposals are offered is this normative, this prescriptive, ameliorative spirit, I think actually all the objections just equally apply. And that's because in the cases I have described, so if that's what you take, if that's what you take the spirit to be, what you're saying is, okay, fair enough. In the case of where the deadbeat father apologizes to their family, they may not actually say, I request your forgiveness. However, their apology would be improved if they said so, because it would be closer to this normative paradigm. But we've seen that that's simply false. Not all apologies are improved if you add a request for forgiveness to them. Similarly, not all apologies are improved if you take them to, if you include an expression of interpersonal commitment as part of that apology. Not all apologies are improved if you add an expression of remorse to them. So it's just not true that an apology is worse for missing one of these elements. And here I really think the problem is methodological. I think it's just not a good idea to think that there is some ideal apology that you can characterize independently of whatever wrong it is an apology for, and then unpack the various elements, and then think you have something that's going to kind of act as a blueprint for apologies in other situations. That's just not how it works. Our apology practice seems to be kind of pluralist in nature. And so what we need is an account that's going to be flexible enough to capture that plurality, but in a principled way. Anyone can give an account, a pluralist account, by just making a big disjunction. So that's not what we want. We want something that's going to capture something unified about apologies, but kind of shed light on why they take this different form in different situations and why they include the elements they do. Okay, so that's what I'll give you now. And that is the normative footprint for it. And so here is, again, just starting with a methodological question. What is it? What is our apologizing practice even for? Why do we have something like an apologetic practice? And I want to suggest that the need for such a practice arises from the specific normative consequences of wrongdoing. So what happens when you act wrongly is that you leave a normative footprint, and then an apology is a speech act which allows us to negotiate that normative footprint interpersonally. So what do I mean by normative footprint? Well, what I mean is that when you act wrongly, and I've already said, so wrongdoing is a matter of violating a moral norm or infringing on someone's right. And it's something that can be intentional or unintentional, and can be justified, it can be excused. So I can unintentionally break a promise, I can justifiably break a promise, I can excusably break a promise. In all of these cases, I will have wronged someone by breaking the promise. And in doing so, I will have made certain changes to the normative landscape. The normative landscape, the way I imagine it is, I imagine it as literally this matrix that we are embedded in, where we're like connected in these, like we're all connected with each other by this complex network of rights and duties and obligations. And we have certain normative powers by which we can change the structure of the normative landscape, right? So when I make a promise, that's like an intentional way of manipulating the normative landscape. I create a duty and a right where there was none before. When I give consent, I change the normative landscape intentionally in a particular way. I waive a right where I had one before. And similarly, I suggest when I wrong someone, I also change the moral landscape in a predictable, systematic way. What is the predictable, systematic way? Well, for one, I create a whole bunch of specific reparative rights and duties. So those are, like, if I wrong you, I'm now under the obligation to acknowledge the wrong I have done, to make amends, to give you an explanation for why I have acted the way I did, to listen to you, to explain myself, to compensate. Another kind of characteristic change that's brought about by wrongdoing is a change in the feeling, rights, and duties that govern our interaction. So not everyone likes that. I like to think about our emotions as bound by deontic norms. So the thought is, when I wrong you, I give you a right to resent me. If I wrong you gravely, I give you a right to resent me, and I might create a right for myself to feel bad about what I did. Sorry, not a right, a duty. I might create an obligation for myself to feel terrible about what I did. If I did something very minor, that I might give you a right to feel mild annoyance with me. So there's going to be disappointment, remorse, sorrow, whatever, a repertoire of emotions in play. My wrongdoing will modify the rights and duties to those emotions. And then the third kind of change I've labeled rights to involvement. So these are the kind of rights to goodwill, trust, help, sympathy that we have for other people. If I treat you really badly as a colleague, if, for example, I behind your back, I say terrible things about you to your line manager, then in doing so, part of what I lose is I lose the right to your trust and to your goodwill and to the help that you would ordinarily be obligated to give me, kind of qua or collegiate relationship. So I jeopardize some of those rights that I had. Okay, so these are the kinds of elements of this. So now, because wrongdoing, comes about in different contexts, and the norms that are being violated are different and can be intentional or unintentional, excused or justified. The specific makeup, the specific signature of any particular wrong is going to differ. It's going to depend on that circumstance. It's going to depend on whether it's excused, whether it's justified, whether it was intentional. But any kind of wrong will leave some signature, which is going to involve some combination of those three elements. And that's what I call the normative footprint of a wrong. Okay, so basically the normative footprint are the normative consequences of the wrong. And so the idea is, because wrongdoing changes the normative landscape in a systematic way, we need to have communicative practices in place in order to be able to make those changes public and to kind of negotiate about those changes and to signal that we, in particular on the wrongdoer's side, to signal that we accept that we are bound by those changes. And so the idea is that in apology specifically, the kind of constitutive aim of the speech act of apology is to communicate the acceptance of the normative footprint of one's wrong. And if we take that line, we then have kind of three conditions. An apology communicates that one's action, so that's on page 4, communicates that one's action has violated a conversationally salient norm. It expresses one's commitment to the norm, and it communicates our acceptance of the normative footprint of our wrongdoing. So you have these three conditions, but in fact, actually the third condition simply subsumes the other two. Because if you, by communicating the acceptance of the normative footprint of your wrong, you are admitting to it as a wrong, so you are making explicit that you have violated the conversationally salient norm, and you also express commitment to that norm. So in fact, the normative footprint account is it's one of the immediately pleasing features about it is that it just subsumes these other two conditions. Okay, so why should we believe in the normative footprint? I think we should believe in it because it has considerable explanatory payoff. And so one thing that it does is it allows us to kind of home in on the norms that govern good apologies and bad apologies. And the guiding thought here is that a good apology needs to match the normative footprint of the wrong. So it needs to be responsive to the actual normative changes that have taken place. And so here are some ways in which we can then diagnose what goes wrong in apologies that seem kind of intuitively bad, defective, and in which case and why we can kind of motivate features that a good apology should have. So in the cases of bad apologies, for example, if you think that it's about communicating the acceptance of a normative footprint, the normative footprint is a kind of package deal of specific rights and duties that come together because they have come up as a result of wrongdoing. And that explains why there's something weird when you explicitly accept certain obligations but reject others. So here are examples. So suppose I say, I apologize for betraying your secret. Of course, you have no right to be upset about my having done so. Something unhappy about that kind of apology. Why is that? Well, because the right to being upset is part of the normative footprint. It's weird to reject that bit of it while accepting that you have in fact betrayed the secret. Similarly, I apologize for not standing up for you. Oh, of course, I do not owe you any explanation for why I failed to stand up for you. There's something incoherent. There's something really defective about it. And again, that seems understandable if we think the normative footprint is this kind of package deal. So this person seems to be kind of confused about what apologies are about. Got a few others there, but I don't need to go through all of them. Okay, so so if the wrongdoing is yours alone, there's something defective about then explicitly only accepting a subset of the reparative duties as yours. There's something weird about that. Okay, and on the flip side, we also get a story, some motivations for what makes for good apologies. So again, I've said a good apologies needs to match the footprint of your wrong. And ideally, that means ideally it needs to communicate not just something inchoate about how you accept the normative consequences of what you did, but something more specific about what those consequences are. And so that's one explanation for why kind of very, very vague apologies, I apologize for what I did, seem a little bit off. They don't give us enough of a handle of what it actually is that the person is owning up to and accepting as a consequence if the apology is for something that's really nondescript. Similarly, I think it explains when and why and to what extent expressions of remorse are called for. So, as I've said, part of the normative footprint is a adjustment of the feeling rights and duties. And so particularly in the cases of grave wrongdoing, you will have an obligation to feel remorse for what you have done. And of course, an excellent way of accepting that fact, like, is to express the remorse in the apology. And so that kind of explains why in some cases these expressions of remorse are called for. When are they called for? Well, they are called for in those cases in which the wrongdoing, in fact, creates this obligation to feel remorse. It also explains the other bit of it is, often a good apology will not just accept that one should feel terrible about what one did, but it will also accept that the fact that the other person is entitled to feel upset with us for what we did. And again, that will be specifically in the cases where the wrong I have done is such that it gives the person the right to be resentful of me for what I did. In that case, it's appropriate to say, I apologize, I know that you are really upset with me. I totally understand that. That's the kind of case where that concession seems right, and that kind of is part of what makes apologies such a risky business, because of course the perfectly legitimate response of the other party in that case is to say, yeah, I am really upset with you. But yeah, so it's insofar as you acknowledge the normative footprint, it's not just a matter about acknowledging and expressing your part of the deal, like what you owe to the other party, but it's also about acknowledging the normative changes, the entitlements that the other person has gained as a result of what you did. Okay, so I think that's basically the outline of the account. I'll just flag some stuff that I want to think about next, but haven't gotten around to thinking about yet. One is precisely the connection between apologies and forgiveness. I think it's obvious that there is such a connection, but I think it takes a lot of work to actually spell out what that connection is. And another thing I want to think about is why some apologies or some patterns of apologizing, and particularly kind of gendered patterns of apologizing, are problematic. So why is there a problem if, I don't know if you know the Amy Schumer sketch of these women experts on who are being interviewed, and then one of them, like, her voice breaks and she starts with "I'm sorry," and then the other one asks for a sip of water because she has an asthma attack and she says "I'm sorry," and they spent the whole session just apologizing until finally one of them breaks down bleeding and says "I'm sorry for existing." Anyway, they don't ever get anywhere for all the apologies they're doing. It's nothing worse than a philosopher recounting a joke. I'm sorry. Anyway, but I mean, that sketch is clearly getting at something. It's getting at a pattern of apologizing that's gendered, and it seems right that there's something problematic about it. And I think it would be cool to think about why that is and whether the normative footprint account gives us a framework to explain that. But I haven't thought about that yet. But you can ask me about it. Cool. I suggest we end here and go to questions. Thank you, guys.